Tonight's story is one of contradictions, a revolution that promised freedom, yet denied it to so many. As you lie back and settle into stillness, we'll travel together through the hushed corners of the American Revolution. Not the tales in textbooks, but the forgotten truths beneath them. You'll hear of liberty, whispered by those who were never meant to be free. If you find comfort in these quiet stories, consider subscribing, or simply leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time sleep found you. Now, close your eyes and let us begin. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow dirt path in the colonies, let's say Virginia or perhaps Georgia, where the soft hum of summer insects hovers over fields of tobacco. You pass rows of men in linen coats and powdered wigs, gathered beneath the shade of a white-columned porch. They are speaking in passionate tones about tyranny, about freedom, about the natural rights of man. They are also owners of human beings. This is the paradox at the heart of America's founding. You're in the year 1775 and the colonies are stirring with rebellion. Tension thickens like humid air before a storm. Pamphlets by Thomas Paine flutter through taverns and parlours. Words like liberty and independence ignite the hearts of white men rich in land, and often richer still in human lives they own. You hear voices quoting John Locke. All men are created equal, they recite. But they do not glance toward the enslaved woman sweeping their doorstep. She's not part of this declaration. The soil of these colonies is rich, not only with crops but with contradiction. Beneath the grand ideals lies a quieter rhythm, one of labourers whose hands are calloused by harvest they will never eat, of native scouts watching with quiet unease from forested borders, of women managing entire households while their names are excluded from civic memory. And yet, these voices, soft and often silenced, are everywhere. In Boston, you might wander cobbled streets where sailors whisper about freedom over mugs of rum. Among them, black freemen like Crispus Attucks, whose blood would be the first spilled in this revolution. Even in Philadelphia's stately halls, you might notice Abigail Adams writing to her husband. "Remember the ladies," she urges, knowing well she might not be. Pause now and breathe. The founding fathers, those venerated architects of the New World, stood shoulder to shoulder beneath liberty trees, but behind them stretched long shadows. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, owned over 600 people in his lifetime. He wrote of freedom while calculating the value of human beings in ledgers. George Washington inherited expanded and managed plantations, keeping his enslaved workers under surveillance, punishing runaways and using teeth pulled from their mouths to replace his own. Their contradiction was not hidden. It was written into their wills, their laws, their buildings. But still, the world they imagined was stirring, a world where empires crumbled and self-governance bloomed. It just did not bloom for everyone. You begin to notice that this revolution, in many ways, was not one event. It was a series of smaller awakenings and deafening silences, a parchment signed by candlelight, while chains clinked quietly outside. In the backcountry, poor white farmers rallied to the cause, not because they loved liberty, but because they hated British taxes on salt and tea. Indentured servants hoped for land. Some even joined the war to shorten their contracts. In native villages, chiefs debated which colonizers posed the greater threat, British governors or American settlers, and in the quarters of enslaved families, whispered prayers rose in the night. Not for independence, but for survival. As you drift into this world, let the rhythm of contradiction guide you. The revolution was a torch lit in darkness, but it left long shadows. This nation was born, with one hand reaching for freedom and the other tightening its grip on those it denied. And so, as the bells of liberty rang across the colonies, they did not echo equally. And you are just beginning to hear the tones that history forgot. Breathe deeply now, because next, we step into the fields, ships, and ports, where freedom's promise was built on the backs of the enslaved. Imagine now that you're standing at the edge of a harbour. The wooden planks beneath your feet are worn smooth from years of footsteps, merchants, sailors, enslaved men and women, and the overseers who drove them forward. Seagulls circle overhead. The water smells faintly of salt and tar. This could be Boston, or Charleston, or Philadelphia. The location shifts, but the rhythm remains the same. It is the 1760s, and these colonies, though seen as provincial, are bustling cogs in a transatlantic machine. You hear it in the creak of dockside cranes lifting barrels of sugar, in the shuffle of boots along the wharf, and in the whispered exchanges as human beings are quietly counted among the cargo. This is a world where the economy depends on forced labour, so deeply that it is invisible to those who benefit from it. In the south, vast plantations stretch toward the horizon, lush and deceptive in their beauty. Fields of cotton, tobacco and indigo wave gently in the breeze, masking the exhaustion of those who tend them from dawn to dusk. Here, the enslaved population is not just labour. They are capital, investments. Planters calculate their worth with chilling precision. A man in his prime, strong and young, might fetch enough to purchase acres. A woman of childbearing age, considered valuable not only for her work, but for the children she might bear, children who would also be enslaved, children who would never be free. And yet, slavery was not confined to the South. Let your thoughts drift northward. In Rhode Island, the rum trade flourished. Ships left with barrels of liquor, bound for Africa's coast. There, these ships were exchanged for people, captured, shackled, and branded. These people, now property, were transported across the Atlantic under unbearable conditions, crowded into dark hulls, with scarcely enough air to breathe. Some did not survive the journey. Those who did were sold, auctioned in open markets, displayed like wares. The northern ports profited. Massachusetts shipbuilders, New York bankers, and New England textile mills all gained wealth from the trade. Even those who never owned a single enslaved person reaped the benefits. Their tea, their clothing, their sugar, all bore the mark of unseen labour. Pause here for a moment and listen. Can you hear the rhythm of the economy? It is the sound of wind through sails, the strike of hammer on nail, but beneath it, there is always something quieter. The sound of skin against rope, the breath of someone who does not speak unless spoken to, the dull ache of backs bent in fields, in kitchens, in cities. In homes both large and modest, enslaved people laboured as domestic workers. They cooked the meals, rocked the children to sleep, polished the silver that would gleam during patriotic dinners. They were there, silent but ever present. In Virginia, entire families were sold together or separated in a moment's decision. A child clinging to a mother's skirt might be pulled away, and that pain, quieted but never forgotten, echoed through generations. And in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations fed colonial wealth, conditions were even harsher. Their lifespans were short, and bodies were broken quickly in pursuit of sweet profit. Some of the molasses and sugar from those islands found their way into American kitchens and teacups, and still, the cry of freedom rang through the streets. Even as human cargo was unloaded from ships, protesters gathered nearby, speaking out against British taxes. They objected to the cost of paper, the control of tea, and the quartering of soldiers. But few, very few, raised their voices against the ownership of other human beings. The irony was thick in the air, like the smell of salt and sweat at the harbour. A man could write a pamphlet about natural rights. While passing a manacled woman being led through the marketplace, he might sip his coffee, read the latest news from London, and never once ask who picked the beans. Now, let us turn to the everyday lives. Imagine waking at first light, not because you choose to, but because your time is not your own. You are a field hand. The overseer's horn sounds and you rise from a bed of straw in a wooden cabin shared with others. Your body is sore. You do not remember a time it wasn't. You walk to the fields as the sky pales with the coming day. You are barefoot. You move in a line. You carry a bag or a hoe. The sun has not yet risen, but already the work begins, and it will continue, under sun and rain, until nightfall. At the end of the day, you return, briefly. Maybe you cook over a small fire. Maybe you sing a song quietly. Not for joy, but for memory. Something your grandmother taught you before you were taken. These moments, small, private, and sacred, are all that remain untouched. They are acts of resistance, of remembering who you are, even when the world tries to erase you. And this was the engine of America's early wealth. Enslaved people harvested the raw goods. Merchants sold them. Elites grew richer. Even revolutionaries, those who decried British oppression, relied on the unpaid labour of others. When you read that America was built on freedom, you must also know it was built on the labour of those who were not free. Breathe again. Let your thoughts drift across the fields and the harbours, past the storehouses and ships, and into the quiet homes where enslaved people sat in silence after long days, dreaming not of liberty speeches, but of dignity, of family, of rest. Soon, in the next chapter, we'll contrast those soaring Enlightenment ideals with the cruel lived realities that so many endured. We'll meet the thinkers and observe how their pens danced around uncomfortable truths. But for now, let your breath slow. Let the weight of contradiction settle like soft dust in your mind. Let yourself drift now into a study lined with shelves of bound leather books, the scent of old parchment and ink lingering in the still air. Outside, the distant clip-clop of horses on cobblestone streets reminds you that this is a city of thought. Philadelphia, perhaps, or Williamsburg. You're surrounded by minds at work, philosophers, statesmen, thinkers whose names will live in marble. Here quills scratch across paper in long looping strokes, a soft candle flame flickers, and through the quiet the sound of men discussing liberty, reason and the natural rights of man echoes gently. You are among the architects of a new nation. Men like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams speak of self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with inalienable rights, that government exists only by the consent of the governed. These ideas are beautiful, elegant, revolutionary. They are also incomplete. Let your thoughts float toward Jefferson. He is a man of paradoxes. In his study at Monticello, perched atop a Virginia hill, Jefferson pens the words that would define a nation. He speaks of liberty while surrounded by the institution of slavery. He owns hundreds. He records their names, their births, their labour, and their value as property in meticulous ledgers. He calculates how much his wealth increases as children are born into bondage. Yet in his writings he warns that slavery is a moral blight. He writes that it will bring divine punishment, that it poisons both master and slave, and still he does nothing to end it. He frees only a few, and only after his death. Now imagine Benjamin Franklin. Older, worldly, curious. In his earlier years, Franklin owned enslaved workers, men and women who laboured in his home and printing press. Later, he came to view slavery as wrong. He joined abolitionist societies and advocated for gradual emancipation. But he never made the fight for freedom his central cause. Franklin, like so many, believed in liberty as a light, but struggled to see the shadow it cast behind him. John Adams, by contrast, never owned slaves. He opposed the institution on principle, and yet even he did little to prioritise abolition. He feared, perhaps, that raising the issue too forcefully would divide the fragile unity of the colonies. These were men of their time, and that time had limits. The Enlightenment ideals they cherished were shaped by European thought. Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Ideas of reason, equality, and freedom were applied selectively. Women were excluded from the conversation. Indigenous people were dismissed as savages, outside the bounds of civilization. And people of African descent were seen not as fellow humans, but as labour, as property, as a problem to be managed. Breathe slowly now. Let yourself imagine the contrast. A grand hall where men in wigs debate freedom over glasses of Madeira, and just outside a man stands barefoot, waiting to load their trunks. He cannot read the words they write, but he lives the consequence of everyone. As the Declaration of Independence was drafted, enslaved people heard whispers of something new, a war for freedom, fought by men who had never tasted chains. Some dared to hope, others knew better. There were moments, quiet and telling, when these contradictions were exposed. In 1773, a group of enslaved men in Massachusetts petitioned the government for freedom. They used the language of the Revolution against the masters who held them. "We expect great things from men who have made such a struggle for liberty themselves," they wrote. Their petition was denied. In sermons and speeches, liberty was praised as sacred, but it was rarely extended beyond the narrow definition of landowning white men. Even in the North, where slavery was less central to the economy, racial hierarchies endured. Freedom, where granted, came with limitations on movement, on employment, on participation in civic life. You might wonder, Did they not see the hypocrisy? Some did, loudly, but many simply compartmentalized. They divided the world into deserving and undeserving, into us and them. Let your mind rest now, in the quiet tension of these contradictions. Imagine sitting beside a young Jefferson as he drafts a letter. He pauses, dips his quill, and writes the words, "All men are created equal." Then he glances out the window at the enslaved workers in the fields below. He does not stop writing. The ink dries, the words take root, and the reality remains unchanged. This is the heart of the American paradox, a revolution that spoke of liberty while denying it to millions, a dream of equality, built atop inequality, and an enduring myth. That freedom, once declared, was equally granted. As you drift further into stillness, let this understanding settle gently in your thoughts. The Enlightenment gave us language for liberation, but it was always shaped by the hands that held the pen. When you're ready, we'll listen to the unheard voices, those who lived not in the halls of power, but in the cabins, kitchens, and fields. In the next segment, we'll walk softly through the lives of enslaved people during the Revolution, not as symbols, but as humans, whose stories still whisper across time. Let the scene settle softly now, a warm night, still and thick with the scent of pine and distant fires. You're standing near a wooden cabin, small, crooked, and sagging slightly under the weight of years. Inside, there is no glass in the windows, only cloth to keep the wind out. The floor is earth, the bed is straw, and the people within are tired. This is not a story about famous names or grand speeches. This is a story of those whose names were rarely recorded, but whose lives shaped the land beneath your feet. It is the 1770s. The colonies are at war. But for the enslaved men, women and children across these lands, war is only one layer of hardship. Their world has long been defined by silence, by endurance, by a rhythm of survival passed down in whispers. Imagine waking before light, stirred not by choice, but by the blow of a voice that owns you. You rise in the dark, hands already aching from yesterday. You gather your tools, your thoughts, and your silence. In the fields, time moves differently. The sun rises slowly, but labor is endless. You bend, you lift, you carry. Each task is known to your body more than your mind. Some days you think of escape. Other days, you think only of making it through until dusk. Now, imagine the sound of distant gunfire. The revolution is no longer just talk, it is real. You hear rumours passed from one plantation to the next, that the British promise freedom to those who flee, that the patriots will win, that change is coming. But promises are like fog. They drift, they vanish, and the cabin walls remain the same. Still, some choose to run. When the moon is high and the house is quiet, they slip into the woods barefoot. The branches cut at their arms. The earth is cold, but they keep walking. Some are caught, some are killed, some make it to British lines and claim freedom, however temporary, but many stay. Not because they believe in the master's cause, but because their children sleep in the next room, because their mothers are too old to run, because the cost of hope is too high. You see, in this chapter of history, the enslaved did not wait passively. They resisted in small ways, in ways that don't fill textbooks, but filled lives with dignity. A woman teaching her son to read in secret, using the edge of a Bible. A man carving a small wooden figure, a face remembered from home. A grandmother passing down a lullaby in a language half forgotten. These acts were rebellions. In the kitchens of plantation houses, women added spices brought from Africa into stews, carrying flavours across oceans. In the fields, songs rose in rhythm with the work, songs layered with hidden messages. They sounded like hymns, but they carried meaning, direction, escape. And in rare moments when overseers were out of sight, laughter could be heard, soft and fleeting, but real. Breathe in this stillness. Now picture the war passing through, a line of soldiers in faded coats marching down the road. They do not look toward the cabins, but the people inside watch carefully. A child born into bondage during these years might grow up with names like Washington and Cornwallis, floating in the air like ghosts. He might hear of battles, Yorktown, Saratoga, but they meant little compared to the daily battle for rest, for food, for safety. And yet, Many did fight. Not just runaways, but enlisted men. Some promised freedom for their service. Others forced to follow their masters into battle. Still others simply trying to survive in a world being torn apart around them. For every name we know, Peter Salem, who fought at Bunker Hill, James Armistead Lafayette, who spied for the Patriots. There are hundreds whose names were never recorded. They fought, they served, and many were returned to slavery. Even in freedom, life was fragile. Black veterans were often denied pensions, land, and respect. Their sacrifices buried beneath myths of a white revolution. But inside those cabins, where oil lamps flickered and voices sang softly through cracked walls, there was something unbreakable. Families, stories, faith, a quiet, enduring hope. Now, let yourself imagine one final image. A woman sits by a dying fire, her child asleep on her lap. She hums a tune, slow, steady, and sad. Outside, a cold wind moves through the trees, and in the far-off distance, fireworks rise to celebrate a newly won freedom. But in her world, the silence remains, and so the story continues. Breathe again. In the next segment, we will follow the brave few who chose flight, who slipped through darkness toward the redcoats, risking all for a promise that might never come true. Let your mind rest and drift gently toward the next chapter. Imagine now that the sky is moonless. You're standing at the edge of a forest clearing, the ground soft beneath your feet. It is silent, except for the whisper of wind in the trees and the cautious breath of someone hidden beside you. This is the moment before flight. The year is 1775, and across the southern colonies, word spreads like smoke through slave quarters and whispered conversations. The British have made a promise. Lord Dunmore's proclamation, spoken from the safety of British guns in Virginia, offered something unimaginable: freedom. For any enslaved person who would flee their patriot masters and fight for the crown, it was a tactical move, yes, but for thousands of enslaved people it was a lifeline. Now imagine what it took to run, to slip away in the darkness, leaving behind everything familiar, to carry no possessions, just a worn shirt, maybe a rag-wrapped bundle, and the desperate hope of something better. Some ran alone, some carried infants, soothed by quiet songs to keep from crying. Others were caught and punished before sunrise. But still they ran. They ran toward British camps, toward red-coated sentries who, despite their empire's own cruel record, held out the possibility of change. And when they arrived, these fugitives became something else: black loyalists. In the early months, many were welcomed. They cooked, cleaned, dug trenches, guided troops. Some were trained to fight. Most were used for labour. They slept on the edges of military camps, exposed to the cold, to disease, to betrayal. But they were no longer property. Their names, so often left out of records, appear now in fragments. In the Book of Negroes, a ledger kept by British officers near the war's end, nearly 3,000 names were recorded. Each entry a person who had fled bondage. Each line a story of bravery, uncertainty, and hope. You might see someone like Lydia Jackson, age 23, formerly belonging to William Carter of Virginia, now boarding a ship to Nova Scotia. Samuel Richards, age 19, ran from Charleston, now serving as a scout for British officers. These entries don't offer emotion, but if you pause and listen between the lines, you can almost hear the breathing of people waiting at harbour's edge, staring across grey Atlantic waters toward an unknown future, because the war was ending, and with it, British forces were preparing to leave. But what of those who had risked everything to join them? In a rare act of moral obligation, or perhaps imperial calculation, many loyalists of African descent were granted passage on ships bound for Nova Scotia. Cold, harsh, unfamiliar, but free. There, they built lives. In Birchtown and Shelburne, they cleared land, endured harsh winters, and faced discrimination from white loyalists. Jobs were scarce. Promises of land were delayed or denied, and still they endured. Some remained in Canada. Others, after years of hardship, chose to board ships once again, this time bound for Sierra Leone, a newly established colony for freed blacks. That journey too was bittersweet. They arrived in Africa as foreigners, carrying English customs, Christian faiths, and the scars of American slavery. But in Freetown, they built something new: churches, schools, families. The arc of their lives crossed oceans and empires. They had been born into bondage and carved a life across 3 continents in search of peace. Pause here and breathe in the weight of that journey, from a Virginia plantation to a battlefield camp, to the icy hills of Nova Scotia, to the coast of Sierra Leone. These were not the stories told on patriotic holidays. They were not carved into monuments, but they remain quietly like footprints beneath falling snow, and not all made it. Many who ran toward the British were recaptured. Some were betrayed by those who promised to help. Others died from disease, starvation, or violence, but their choice to run, to hope, to imagine a life beyond ownership was in itself a kind of victory. Now let your thoughts settle. Imagine a small fire burning at the edge of a loyalist encampment. A man stares into the flames, rubbing his hands for warmth. His coat is too thin. He does not know what tomorrow holds, but he knows he's no longer a slave. That thought, even if fleeting, is enough to carry him through the night. When you're ready, we'll walk beside the others, those who stayed, those who fought for the Patriots, believing freedom could be won by shedding blood for the revolution itself. Their stories are next. Let yourself drift now, to a quiet clearing just before dawn. The mist clings low to the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat pulses softly, steady, slow, not of war, but of waiting. A group of men stands in formation. Their coats are worn, their boots cracked, their rifles older than the war itself. Among them stand black soldiers, silent, still, watching the horizon. This is not a history often told, but it is real. From the earliest days of the American Revolution, African Americans, enslaved and free, stood among the ranks of the Continental Army. Imagine the uncertainty, the quiet, almost invisible gamble, to serve a cause that had never fully seen you, to fight for a country that had written you out of its promises, and yet to believe, maybe, just maybe, that freedom could be earned. In Massachusetts, where the war first sparked, free black men joined early. They were not always welcomed. Some officers hesitated. Others accepted anyone willing to bleed for liberty. In 1775, Peter Salem stood on the front lines at Bunker Hill. Accounts credit him with firing the shot that felled British Major Pitcairn, a critical moment, largely forgotten. Then there was James Armistead Lafayette, an enslaved man who posed as a runaway and slipped behind British lines. He fed false information to the British and real intelligence to the Americans. He helped tip the scales at Yorktown, where the war would effectively end. Yet for all he did, he had to petition for his freedom after the war. His master had to be persuaded. Now imagine standing in the cold of Valley Forge, winter biting through thin fabric. Fires are small, rations smaller. Black and white soldiers huddled together, united not in equality, but in the hunger and frost of survival. At its peak, the Continental Army was 15 to 20% black. Most were never officially recognized. Some were promised freedom in exchange for their service. Others were sent by their enslavers, forced to fight in their place. And while a few were emancipated, many were returned to bondage after their muskets were laid down. You might now picture William Billy Lee, not a soldier, but the personal servant to George Washington throughout the war. He rode with the general, carried his gear, knew his secrets. He was enslaved. But always beside the man history would later call father of a nation. Lee was freed in Washington's will, one of the very few. And yet, the story doesn't end there. In state militias, some black men were barred entirely. In others, they were welcomed briefly, until politics, fear, or racial laws forced them out. The rules shifted constantly, and so, their service remained unstable. Gratitude came slowly, records were lost, and pensions rarely paid. Now, rest your thoughts for a moment, and imagine one of these men, years later, old, weathered, forgotten. He lives in a small cabin on the edge of a growing nation. He tells no stories, because no one asks. He receives no medals, because none were minted. He simply remembers. The friends who never returned, the officers who forgot his name, the morning sun rising over distant hills after long marches and longer battles, And yet, he does not regret serving, because in the stillest corners of his memory he once believed that freedom might rise from sacrifice, that maybe, just maybe, the new nation would remember the hands that helped build it. But the truth is, most did not. Their names faded, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced, until now. Breathe in, and let the image fade gently. Black men fought on both sides of the revolution, some for the British, some for the Americans, but all with the hope that service might open a door long closed. In the next chapter, we turn to the very men who led the charge for independence, the Founding Fathers, and we look not only at their words, but at the people they owned, the choices they made, and the system they preserved. Let your mind rest. The drums have quieted, but the story deepens. Let the world shift now, into the echoing quiet of a plantation estate. The sun is setting, casting a golden haze over rolling hills, well-trimmed hedges and neat white fences. A breeze stirs the leaves in the trees, gentle and calm. But beneath this serene image lies a different story. This is the world of the Founding Fathers, men revered in marble, men whose portraits hang in public buildings, whose names are etched into the fabric of the nation. But behind the polished language and visionary ideals, there were shadows, and the deepest of those shadows was slavery. Let us begin with George Washington. At his Mount Vernon estate, over 300 enslaved people lived and laboured by the time of his death. They built the walls, tended the fields, cared for the horses, cooked his meals, sewed his garments, and brought him wine. Their names included William, Charlotte, Hercules, and Oni. Washington was aware of the contradictions. He spoke of abolition in cautious tones, but took great measures to avoid losing enslaved workers to Northern freedom laws. In Philadelphia, where gradual emancipation was underway, he rotated his enslaved staff out of the city every 6 months to prevent them from gaining legal residency and claiming freedom. He did not speak of this in his letters, but his records show it clearly. He freed his enslaved workers only in his will, after his wife's death, and even then, only those he personally owned. The others, held under Martha Washington's estate, remained in bondage. Now move softly to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's mountaintop home, elegant, harmonious, designed with purpose. Here, enslaved workers quarried stone, crafted bricks, and built the home they would never own. They woke before him, laid fires in his study, and quietly stepped back into silence as he began to write. Jefferson spoke eloquently against slavery. He called it a moral depravity, a hideous blot. But he also owned more than 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. He sold them to cover debts. He used their labour to finance his inventions and books, and he fathered children with one of them, Sally Hemings, a young woman brought from Paris. Their relationship, often romanticised, was shaped by imbalance. She was his property. She could not leave. She bore 6 of his children, and he freed only a few. Jefferson's letters are filled with contradictions. He feared the mixing of races while living with a mixed-race family. He praised liberty while designing systems to sustain slavery. Then we find James Madison, architect of the Constitution, a man of careful thought and profound intellect. And yet, he too held men and women in bondage. He once suggested that slavery was a misfortune, not of the enslaved, but of society. At his Virginia estate, he organized the labor of more than 100 enslaved people. He rarely spoke of them by name. Even James Monroe and Patrick Henry, known for their bold calls for liberty, held people in bondage while declaring that "give me liberty or give me death" was the highest ideal. Each of these men wrestled with slavery in different ways. Some expressed regret, few took action. To preserve unity among the states, they avoided the topic in public debates. Slavery was the sleeping serpent, coiled at the heart of the new republic, and so. In 1787, when the Constitution was drafted, slavery was not abolished, not even named. Instead, it was protected, quietly and thoroughly. The 3/5 Compromise declared that enslaved people would be counted as partial humans for political representation, boosting the power of slaveholding states. The Fugitive Slave Clause ensured that those who escaped would be returned. No rights, no freedoms, only numbers. Now, breathe slowly. and imagine the sound of quills scratching across parchment, as these laws were written in elegant script. In another room, a woman stirs a pot over an open flame, a child sweeps the floor, a man repairs the roof. They are not seen, but they are there. Their names are not in the preamble, but their labour built the room where it was written. And so, the paradox hardened. The very men who declared liberty sacred chose property over people, unity over justice, silence over truth, but not all agreed. John Laurens, a lesser-known patriot, argued bitterly against slavery. He proposed arming thousands of enslaved men and granting them freedom for their service. His plan failed. He died young, and his cause faded with him. Now let yourself rest in the stillness of contradiction. To understand the founding of America, you must hold both truths, that it was built on ideals, and also on exploitation, that the architects of liberty were also owners of bodies, and that even the most sacred words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were written, while someone stood quietly behind the author, waiting for the next command. In the next segment, we will step even further back, to the nations already living on this land before 1776, to the sovereign peoples whose worlds were already complex and soon to be shattered. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift outward, toward the forest trails and sacred rivers of another story waiting to be told. Let your breath ease now, as the world around you becomes older. The smoke of gunpowder fades, the sound of musket fire grows distant, and in its place comes birdsong. You're standing in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and ancient oaks. The wind stirs the leaves gently. Somewhere nearby, a river murmurs across stones. This land, so often described as wilderness, was never empty. It was home, long before the Declaration of Independence, before colonies and crowns and constitutions. This land pulsed with nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to many as the Iroquois, a union of 6 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora. Their governance was sophisticated, decisions made through councils, power balanced among clans, women held influence, guiding the selection of leaders. The great law of peace, an oral constitution, governed diplomacy and ethics long before European contact. Imagine sitting in one of their longhouses, where fire crackled at the centre and stories passed from one voice to the next. You would hear of ancestors, of sky women, of peacekeepers and wampum belts that carried memory. Further south, you would find the Cherokee Nation with structured towns, cultivated fields, written laws, and trade routes that stretched from the Carolinas to the Mississippi. The Shawnee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Delaware, each with their own languages, systems of law, spiritual beliefs, and relationship to the land. They did not view the earth as property. It was kin. It was memory. It was sacred. In what would later be called New England, the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pequot managed seasonal movements with care. They understood the rhythms of migration, of planting, of harvest. Their maps were made in their minds and in the motion of the stars. And in the western forests and Great Lakes region, the Anishinaabe, including Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, lived in cycles of abundance. They fished the lakes, tapped trees for sap, and followed the teachings of the 7 grandfathers. Pause here and imagine yourself among them, not as an outsider, but as a traveller, quiet, listening, learning. You see children playing near a stream, their laughter mixing with the chirp of birds. You see elders sharing tobacco and memory beneath a rising moon. You hear no muskets, no proclamations, only the steady pulse of a people rooted in time. These were not scattered bands of hunters. These were nations, recognized by treaty, feared by empires, and courted, carefully, by both Britain and France. When colonists arrived, they entered into a world with rules already written, a world of alliances and diplomacy, of trade and ceremony, a world that did not see itself as primitive, but as balanced. And so, when the revolution approached, native nations did not simply wait for the outcome. They calculated, they debated, they chose. Some sought neutrality. Some sided with the British, believing they would offer a better chance at sovereignty. Others, like the Oneida, fought alongside the Americans. It was not simple. It was survival. And always, there was the land. Stretching from the edges of New York to the high plains, from Georgia's forests to the Mississippi River, these lands were not frontiers, they were homes, marked by burial mounds, sacred stones, family trails, and memory. Even as the colonists spoke of freedom, they also spoke of land hunger. To them, these vast territories were potential. To native nations, they were inheritance. And so, before the first shot of the revolution was fired, there was already a quiet storm gathering. Not of war, but of erasure. Let yourself rest in this moment before that storm breaks, before policies, before broken treaties, before marches and removals and maps redrawn by strangers. Here, the forest still stands, the river still sings, the fires still burn in council circles, and the people are still sovereign. In the next chapter, we will walk with them into the chaos of revolution and witness what happens when a new nation rises over lands already claimed by nations older still. Close your eyes now, let the wind return. But this time, it carries the smell of smoke. The forest is no longer still, the drumbeat of hoofbeats stirs the soil, and the revolution, once thought of as distant, is here. But this is not Boston, not Philadelphia. This is Indian country. As the American Revolution ignited in cities and coastal towns, its flames quickly spread across native lands, not by accident, but by design. The frontier, so often romanticized in later years, was a battlefield, a place where competing visions of the future collided, where Britain, the colonies, and indigenous nations made choices and bore consequences. For many native peoples, the war was not about independence. It was about preservation, land, autonomy, life. Most indigenous nations viewed the colonists' expansion with suspicion. They had seen how treaties were made and broken, how land was taken, piece by piece. To them, the British Crown, distant and disinterested, had at least drawn limits. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued after the 7 Years' War, had attempted to halt colonial settlement beyond the Appalachians. It wasn't perfectly enforced, but it was, symbolically, a line. And so, when war broke out between the colonies and the Crown, many native nations chose the side they believed would protect their sovereignty. The Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, educated, strategic and loyal to the British, led warriors in defence of Haudenosaunee lands. He believed that the British victory would preserve native territories. Others, like the Oneida, sided with the Patriots, hoping for respect and alliances in the new republic. But the revolution did not honour allegiance. It burned everything in its path. Entire native villages were razed, crops destroyed, winter stores looted or burned. Treaties made with one tribe were ignored when inconvenient. In 1779, General George Washington authorized the Sullivan Campaign, a scorched earth military expedition aimed at punishing the Iroquois nations allied with the British. More than 40 Haudenosaunee villages were destroyed, fields of corn, beans and squash burned to ash. The goal was not just military victory but starvation, displacement, submission. Let yourself imagine the silence after such destruction. A field blackened with smoke, a longhouse reduced to embers, children gathered near a river, not knowing where their next meal would come from. It was not a war of conquest, it was a war of removal. Meanwhile, in the Ohio Valley, the Shawnee, Mingo and Delaware nations resisted fiercely. The Revolutionary War there was even more brutal, marked by ambushes, reprisals and atrocities on both sides. For Native Americans, the war blurred lines. Sometimes the British abandoned their indigenous allies to secure peace. Sometimes the Americans made promises they never intended to keep. Often, native voices were excluded entirely from negotiations that reshaped their futures. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to end the war, no native leaders were present, and yet their lands were ceded, their autonomy erased, their sovereignty ignored. The new United States claimed everything east of the Mississippi, not through conquest, but through paper. And so, indigenous nations, many of whom had tried to remain neutral, or who had chosen sides carefully, found themselves stripped of land, pushed westward, and written out of the revolutionary story. Now breathe in again, and imagine the forest after the war, quieter, fewer voices, trails once known, overgrown. Ceremonies that once echoed through the trees now practiced in secret. But not all was lost. Many native nations rebuilt. They gathered their people. They passed down memory. They resisted. Even after defeat, they preserved the core of who they were. Language, ceremony, connection to land. And in that quiet defiance, a different kind of revolution continued. One not of muskets and cannons, but of endurance. Let that word rest in your mind now. Endurance. Through war, through betrayal, through fire and silence. In the next segment, we will follow one of these stories even more closely. The story of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and how a union built on peace was torn apart by war. Let your breath soften now. The fire has dimmed, but the memory remains. Now, as you settle deeper into calmness, imagine the sprawling forests of what would become upstate New York. Dense with towering trees, the scent of pine and damp earth thick in the air, here lies the homeland of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois, the people of the Longhouse. An alliance of 6 nations bound by the great law of peace: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora, woven together by centuries of shared governance, rituals, and respect. Picture the longhouses, large wooden structures stretched like arms reaching through the forest, their smoke rising in gentle spirals against the sky. Inside, families gather around fires, elders speak of ancestors, laws, and harmony. The Confederacy was a powerful diplomatic force, a nation whose voice commanded respect from European powers. But then the revolution stirred the calm. Divide and conquer, a strategy that would prove deadly. The Haudenosaunee nations did not stand united during the revolution. The conflict split the Confederacy as deeply as the war split the colonies. Some nations, like the Mohawk, led by the fierce and educated Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, sided with the British. They believed the crown would protect their lands from colonial expansion. Brant was a skilled diplomat and warrior who travelled to England, advocating for his people. Others, such as the Oneida and Tuscarora, allied with the American patriots, hoping that supporting independence might preserve their sovereignty in a new nation. The remaining nations struggled with neutrality, caught between promises, threats, and the brutal realities of war. Now picture the tension growing like a storm. This internal split fractured the Confederacy's foundations. Families and clans found themselves on opposite sides. Trade routes were severed, old alliances strained. The peace that had held for centuries began to unravel. In 1779, the American forces launched the Sullivan Campaign, ordered by George Washington. This scorched earth expedition aimed to break the power of the Iroquois nations allied with the British. Imagine the advancing soldiers, boots stomping through forest paths, cannons rumbling in the distance. Villages were burned, food stores destroyed, fields of corn, vital for winter survival, were razed. Entire communities were displaced. Families fled into the wilderness, enduring bitter cold and hunger. Children's cries echoed in the night. Elders struggled to keep hope alive. The campaign left a trail of destruction, a deliberate attempt not only to win battles but to erase a way of life. Think now of a longhouse reduced to ash, its walls blackened, memories turned to smoke. But the Haudenosaunee people did not vanish. Though fragmented and suffering, they regrouped. In exile, some joined British forces in Canada, fighting on foreign soil. Others sought peace, rebuilding their nations from the ashes. Their resilience carried them forward. The war inflicted wounds that would not heal for generations. The Confederacy's unity was weakened, but the great law of peace survived in memory and ceremony. Today, the Haudenosaunee people continue to honour those laws, maintaining their language, culture, and governance. Let your thoughts drift to the quiet forests now reclaimed by time. The trees grow tall once more. The rivers flow steady and clear. The voices of the past whisper in the wind, and in that whisper, the promise of renewal. Pause and breathe deeply. The fracture of a great confederacy was a tragedy, but it also bore witness to strength, survival, and the enduring spirit of a people who refuse to be erased. As night deepens around you, imagine the glow of a small fire in a longhouse, the crackle of burning wood, stories told softly in the flickering light. The past is not gone. It lives on, in you, in me, in the earth beneath our feet. When you're ready, we will turn next to another story. The quiet, often overlooked voices of women during the revolution, their sacrifices, struggles and strength that shaped the course of history. Let your breath soften. The longhouse fires fade gently and the night carries you onward. Close your eyes and picture a quiet colonial village just as dawn breaks. Soft light spills across wooden clapboard houses, the scent of fresh earth and wood smoke hanging in the cool morning air. Women stir within their homes, beginning their day with practiced motions, grinding grain, tending hearth fires, mending worn clothes. Their hands move with skill and purpose, yet their stories often remain unheard. During the American Revolution, women stood firmly at the crossroads of upheaval and endurance. Though they could not vote or hold office, their contributions were vital, woven through the daily rhythms of life and war. Imagine Abigail Adams sitting at a simple desk, pen in hand. She writes to her husband John Adams with a quiet but firm plea. Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favourable to them than your ancestors. Her words echo a yearning for recognition, a whisper of early feminist thought. Yet the new nation would take centuries to fully hear her call. Elsewhere, women like Molly Pitcher carried water to soldiers on the battlefield, sometimes even taking up arms when their husbands fell. Her name became legend, a symbol of women's quiet bravery. Now picture the spinning wheels turning late into the night. Colonial women spun thread and wove cloth to clothe the Continental Army. They organised fundraising efforts, gathered supplies and baked bread for soldiers far from home. Their kitchens became centres of revolution, places where political ideas simmered alongside pots and pans. Many followed the army camps as camp followers, cooking, nursing the wounded, washing clothes, doing the essential work that kept the army alive in harsh conditions. In quieter moments, women managed farms and businesses, balancing uncertainty with resilience. They navigated debts, scarcity, and the constant absence of husbands and sons. Picture a woman tending to a garden while children play nearby, her face calm but lined with worry, eyes steady as she plans for an uncertain future. Yet, despite their sacrifices, the new republic offered women little political power or legal rights. They could not vote, own property independently if married, or hold office. Their names rarely appeared in official records, their voices muffled beneath the declarations of liberty. Still, women forged communities. They passed down stories and traditions. They kept alive the spark of hope. Take a moment to imagine the gentle rhythm of their days, the clink of needles knitting warm socks, the soft murmur of lullabies sung by mothers to children in the fading light, the steady beating of drums in distant camps, a constant reminder of a world shifting beyond the village. Their contributions were subtle but profound, a quiet revolution alongside the louder battles. In the next segment, we will explore the unseen burdens that war imposed on women, the long nights of loneliness, the relentless work, and the emotional toll carried in silence. Rest now, cradled in the understanding that even in the shadows, their strength shaped the dawn of a nation. Now, as you settle into the calm of the evening, imagine a small colonial homestead, framed by fading light and the soft rustle of trees. Inside, the walls are modest but well kept, filled with the lingering scents of wood smoke, dried herbs, and fresh bread cooling on a windowsill. Here live the wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters, the silent witnesses and unsung survivors of revolution. The war was not just fought on battlefields, it stretched deep into these homes where women bore burdens unseen by history's usual gaze. Imagine Sarah, whose husband marches off to war, his uniform still crisp and hopeful. She watches him leave through tear-blurred eyes, knowing he may never return. Her days unfold in a rhythm of waiting and working, stretching scarce resources to feed children whose fathers' names are whispered in prayers. The fields still need tending. The livestock must be cared for. Debts pile quietly like dust in corners. Neighbours come and go, some seeking shelter, some leaving for safer lands. Yet, Sarah moves through these trials with quiet strength. Now picture Mary, a widow by the war's end. Her husband fell at a distant battle, leaving her with a farm to manage and children to raise alone. Land laws favour men, creditors demand payment. Her claim to property is tenuous, bound to the name of her absent or deceased husband. She negotiates, pleads, and perseveres, often at great personal cost. Across towns and countryside, countless women like Sarah and Mary navigated similar realities. Some followed the armies as camp followers, nursing the sick, tending the wounded, cleaning bloodied uniforms, tasks filled with exhaustion and danger. Others sent letters across miles, clutching hopes and fears between their fingers. Children sometimes lost fathers, brothers, or older siblings to war's relentless grasp. Orphaned children were taken in by extended families or neighbours, weaving new networks of care amid uncertainty. Women often served as the backbone of farms and households, managing planting and harvest, repairing homes and bartering goods. Their labour was constant, physical and crucial, yet little recognised. Imagine a winter evening where the hearth's glow flickers against worn faces. A mother soothes a restless child. Her thoughts drift to news from distant battlefields. Her heart carries both hope and dread. War's emotional toll settled heavily. Grief mingled with determination, fear with fierce love, loneliness with an unspoken understanding of shared sacrifice. Legal and social systems of the time offered little comfort. Married women's property was legally controlled by their husbands. Widows had limited rights, and divorce was rare and stigmatized. Even as the ideals of liberty spread, the reality for most women remained confined within strict roles. Yet, some women pushed boundaries. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army, serving bravely for over a year before her identity was discovered. Her story was extraordinary, a whisper of rebellion against gender norms and an assertion of agency. Still, for most, the fight was fought in quieter ways. Within homes, within communities, through resilience and resolve. Rest your mind now on this unseen battlefield. Hear the soft cadence of spinning wheels, the hushed conversations over knitted socks, the gentle rocking of cradles. These moments held the promise of continuity, a hope that life, even scarred by war, would endure. As the night deepens, imagine these women resting after long days, sometimes weeping softly, sometimes dreaming of peace. Their sacrifices are threads woven through the fabric of a nation's birth. In the next chapter, we will turn our gaze to another group often overlooked: indentured servants, bound by contracts, trapped in a world where freedom was always just out of reach. Let your breath slow, let your heart soften, and let the quiet strength of these women settle like a gentle lullaby. As you settle deeper into calmness, imagine a bustling colonial port town in the early morning light. Ships creak gently against the docks, their sails fluttering in a soft breeze. The salty tang of the sea mixes with the earthy aroma of fresh timber and spilled grain. Among the crowds gathering on the wharves are men and women, new arrivals to this strange land, many with dreams of freedom and fortune. But for tens of thousands, arrival meant a different fate. They were indentured servants, bound by contracts that promised passage to America in exchange for years of labour. Imagine Seamus, a young man from Ireland, stepping off a crowded ship with worn clothes and tired eyes. His contract binds him for 7 years, during which he will work for a landowner. No wages, no choice of task, only the promise of freedom at the end. The reality is harsh. Days begin before dawn. Sunlight filters weakly through crude wooden cabins as servants rise to begin chores. They plant tobacco, harvest wheat, build fences and repair homes. Their hands blister and callous. Their backs bend beneath heavy loads. Mealtimes are brief and simple. Bread, salted meat and watery stew. Sickness often spreads in cramped quarters. Medical care is scarce. For many, the term of service stretches on, extended by punishment or debts. They live in a world of strict rules. Leaving without permission is punishable. Complaints fall on deaf ears. Families are separated, sold or broken apart. Marriage is often discouraged by masters, yet hope lingers. Servants dream of the day their contract ends, when they might own land, build homes and live freely. Some eventually purchase small plots or start businesses. Others remain trapped in cycles of poverty and labour. Indentured servants came from various places: Ireland, Scotland, Germany and even Africa. Though distinct from chattel slavery, their lives were marked by coercion and limited rights. Women servants faced particular challenges. Imagine Anne, an indentured woman tasked with household chores and childcare. She is vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Her contract offers little protection, yet she labours with determination, nurturing hope for a different future. The social divide between servants and landowners was stark. Servants were viewed as lower class, unfree in practice despite legal rights. Their voices rarely recorded in history books. The Revolutionary War altered little for indentured servants. Many were conscripted into armies or left to struggle with disrupted economies. Promises of liberty and equality rarely reached their lives. As night falls, imagine the flickering candlelight in a servant's quarters, the quiet whisper of prayers, the longing for freedom and dignity. Their stories are the quiet shadows behind the founding narrative. Now breathe deeply and rest in this reflection. Think of the countless unnamed men and women whose labour built the young nation, yet whose freedom was always deferred. In the next segment, we will step into the lives of the rural poor, tenant farmers and frontiersmen, whose struggles also shaped the early republic, often unnoticed. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift gently like the soft wind through fields of grain. Now, as the evening deepens, picture yourself standing on the edge of a vast expanse of rolling hills and dense forests. The air is cool and fragrant with pine and earth, and the fading sun casts a soft amber glow over humble cabins scattered across the land. This is the frontier, where the rural poor lived. Tenant farmers, smallholders, frontiersmen. People often overlooked in grand histories, but whose lives were filled with quiet endurance and steadfast hope. Imagine Thomas, a tenant farmer in Virginia, waking before dawn. His hands are rough from labour, his clothing patched and worn. He steps out into the crisp morning, the soil beneath his boots soft and moist with dew. Thomas does not own the land he tills, he rents it from a wealthy landowner. His crops are modest, corn, beans, maybe a few tobacco plants, and every harvest must meet rents and debts. Life here is a constant balance on a knife's edge. Taxes and rents consume much of the meagre yield. Weather can turn from blessing to curse with a sudden frost or drought. Markets are distant and transportation slow and uncertain. The Revolutionary War added strain. Men like Thomas often served in local militias or the Continental Army, leaving families to manage farms alone. War disrupted trade and labour. Food shortages and inflation made daily survival more precarious. Despite their sacrifices, bearing arms and paying taxes, the rural poor found little political power. The new government favoured wealthy elites who controlled land and commerce. Voting rights were often tied to property ownership, excluding many like Thomas. Frustration simmered quietly. In Massachusetts, this discontent would erupt a decade later as Shays' Rebellion, where farmers protested debt, taxes, and foreclosures. Now, picture Mary, a widow tenant farmer's wife, managing the household and fields with grit and determination. She rises early to tend livestock, bake bread, and mend clothing. Her hands steady, her spirit unyielding. Yet the daily grind wears on her. Her children need education, but schools are few. She worries over debts and the future. Communities on the frontier were tight-knit but often isolated. Neighbours gathered for barn raisings, church services, and communal meals, sharing news and lending help. Religion offered solace and social connection. Meeting houses echoed with hymns and sermons, grounding people amid uncertainty. Imagine the stars above, bright and countless, offering silent company to those who toiled beneath them. The rural poor lived in a world of hard work, limited means, and fragile hope. Their stories rarely entered the official narrative of liberty, but they laid the physical and social foundation of the young nation, building roads, clearing forests, and standing guard on distant borders. As you breathe slowly now, imagine the quiet strength in their hands, the resilience in their hearts. Though forgotten by many, their legacy endures in the soil, the villages, the very fabric of America. In the next chapter, we will examine the Constitution itself, how this foundational document enshrined liberty for some, while excluding many others. Rest gently now, let the peaceful countryside fold around you like a soft blanket. Now, as night deepens, settle into a calm place, and imagine a dimly lit room in Philadelphia, 1787. Heavy wooden tables are scattered with parchment, quill pens resting in inkwells. A group of men sit in serious discussion, faces illuminated by candlelight, drafting what will become the United States Constitution. This document is intended as a blueprint for a new nation, a symbol of liberty and governance by the people. Yet beneath its lofty words lies a complex web of compromises, some visible, many hidden. Picture James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, thoughtfully adjusting a draft. He wrestles with balancing power between large and small states, between federal and local authority. Now listen closely to the unspoken voices in the room. Who is absent? Women, enslaved people, Native Americans, poor tenant farmers, all those whose freedom and rights will not be fully recognized here. The Constitution established the framework for government, but it also embedded deep inequalities. For example, the 3/5 compromise counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. This political calculation increased the power of slaveholding states, ensuring their influence in Congress, while denying full humanity and rights to enslaved people. Imagine the irony. A nation claiming liberty while legally codifying human bondage. Voting rights were limited. Most states restricted suffrage to white male property owners. Women, native peoples, free black individuals and poor men were excluded from political participation. Native sovereignty was ignored entirely. Land treaties were made without indigenous consent. Tribal nations were not considered part of the new political order, and their lands were treated as available for settlement. The Constitution did not outlaw slavery, instead it protected it. Slaveholders were assured their property would remain secure, and the slave trade was permitted to continue for 2 more decades. The Founding Fathers debated these issues with varying degrees of conviction and hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson wrote of universal rights, yet owned hundreds of enslaved people. George Washington expressed personal discomfort with slavery but maintained his plantations. Benjamin Franklin became an abolitionist late in life, but most compromises favoured maintaining the status quo. This document, often hailed as a beacon of freedom, was also a pact with inequality. Imagine the tension in that room, principles clashing with economic interests and social norms. For many, this was the beginning of a long, fraught journey toward expanding liberty. The Constitution laid foundations, yes, but also walls. As you breathe slowly, consider the silent exclusions, the voices unheard in those candlelit rooms. Their struggles for recognition would echo through the centuries. This document was not the end of the story, but a chapter in an ongoing battle for true freedom. Rest your mind in this reflection. The ink dries on parchment, and the future waits quietly in the shadows. Next, we will explore what happened to Black Americans in the New Republic, the promises deferred and the struggles that defined their early lives. Let your breath soften and your thoughts drift gently as the night deepens. Now, as you settle deeper into a calm and restful state, imagine the early years of the United States, the new republic forging its identity. Cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston bustle with activity. The scent of fresh paper mingles with wood smoke and the salty sea breeze. But beneath this energetic surface lies a quieter, harsher reality for many Black Americans. Though the revolution spoke of liberty, freedom for black men, women and children was a complicated and often painful promise. Picture Phillis Wheatley, the first African-American poet to publish a book of poetry in 1773. Her eloquence and intellect challenged the prevailing notions of race and ability, yet even her talent could not erase the bonds of slavery that held so many. In the northern states, gradual emancipation laws began to take shape. States like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts passed acts freeing children born after certain dates or emancipating enslaved people over time. Imagine Sarah, a free black woman living in Philadelphia, navigating a society that legally acknowledges her freedom but socially restricts her. She works as a laundress, earns modest wages, and lives with the constant awareness of racial prejudice and limited rights. Her community is tight-knit, bound by churches, mutual aid societies, and shared history. Yet, even in freedom, she faces segregation, exclusion from schools, and restrictions on voting and property ownership. Now, turn your mind to the South. Here, the institution of slavery hardened and expanded. Cotton and tobacco plantations grew larger, and the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 intensified demand for enslaved labor. States codified harsher slave laws, black codes, restricting movement, assembly, and education. Imagine James, an enslaved man on a Virginia plantation, whose days are filled with backbreaking work from dawn to dusk. He dreams of freedom, whispers of escape passing between slaves like secret prayers. The hope of emancipation that some had held during the revolution fades as southern states tighten control. Yet, resistance persists, from subtle acts like work slowdowns and maintaining family bonds, to more overt rebellions and escape attempts. Enslaved people fought daily for dignity and life. The African Methodist Episcopal Church formed as a space of spiritual and social refuge. Free black communities created schools and newspapers, asserting identity and rights despite oppression. Legal battles began, cases challenging slavery and discrimination, but progress was slow and perilous. As you breathe deeply, imagine the weight of this history, the clash between the lofty ideals of the new nation and the lived realities of black Americans. The contradictions ripple across generations. The promise of liberty was delayed, deferred, but never fully extinguished. Their strength and resilience planted seeds for future struggles and triumphs. As night deepens, imagine a flickering candle in a quiet room, lighting the pages of an untold story still unfolding. In the next segment, we will follow the long and painful journey of native tribes pushed westward after the revolution, a story of loss, displacement, and survival. Let your breath slow and your thoughts drift gently toward rest. As you settle into a gentle calm, imagine the vast forests, rivers, and valleys once held by native nations stretching across the eastern lands of the new United States. These lands, sacred and abundant, were home to the Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, Shawnee, Delaware, and many others. Before the Revolution, these nations governed themselves with complex systems of law, ceremony, and diplomacy. Now, picture the shifting tides of war and settlement. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War, redrew borders without consulting native peoples. Their lands were ceded, treaties ignored or broken, and their sovereignty dismissed. Imagine a Cherokee village by a river, peaceful and thriving, but the ground beneath their feet trembles as settlers move ever westward. Tensions rise, military campaigns and land seizures disrupt lives. In 1790, the new United States government began formal Indian removal policies, systematic efforts to push native nations from their ancestral homes. Families were forced to relocate. Imagine Little Deer, a child watching as elders pack belongings into canoes and wagons, preparing to leave lands held for generations. The journey westward is fraught with hardship. Disease, hunger, and loss shadow every step. Communities fracture. Cultural sites are abandoned or destroyed. Yet in this upheaval, survival and adaptation emerge. Native leaders negotiate treaties to protect what remains. Ceremonies continue in new lands, preserving identity. Some tribes resist fiercely, engaging in battles and diplomacy. Others forge alliances to secure fragile peace. The pain of displacement is profound but does not erase spirit. Today, descendants honor their ancestors through language revitalization, cultural preservation, and political advocacy. As you breathe deeply, imagine the quiet strength of these displaced peoples. The forests and rivers remember. The songs and stories carry on. Their silence is long, but their voice endures. Rest now, embraced by the knowledge that history's echoes shape the present. In the next segment, we will explore how enslaved people helped build the nation's foundations, often without recognition. Let your breath soften and your mind drift gently into peaceful rest. As you sink further into calm, imagine the bustling port cities and rural plantations of early America, where commerce and labor intertwined in a complex dance. The smell of salted fish mingles with tobacco smoke and the sharp tang of sawdust from nearby shipyards. Here, the wealth and infrastructure of the young nation was shaped, often by those denied freedom. Picture enslaved men and women working side by side with artisans, dock workers, and farmers. Their labor built roads, cleared fields, constructed homes, and tended to the ships that connected America to the wider world. Imagine Abraham, an enslaved carpenter in Charleston, crafting fine furniture destined for wealthy landowners. His hands are skilled and sure, though his name is seldom recorded in ledgers or histories. Across the South, the prosperity of plantations depended entirely on the unpaid toil of enslaved people. Cotton fields stretched wide, tobacco barns towered, and sugar mills hummed, industries fueling economic growth but sustained by cruelty. In northern cities, enslaved and free black workers contributed to shipbuilding, ironworks, and household labor. Their contributions were vital, yet their status remained precarious. The irony is stark. A nation prided on liberty owed much of its early comfort and power to those who lived in bondage. Consider the ports of New York and Boston, where enslaved people loaded cargo and built warehouses that supported trade and finance. At the same time, free black communities organised schools, churches and mutual aid societies, laying groundwork for future generations. As you breathe slowly, imagine the voices that history often forgets, the whispered prayers in longhouses and hidden meetings where stories of freedom were shared, the secret networks aiding escapes, the quiet acts of defiance and resilience. Though unacknowledged in official narratives, the work and spirit of enslaved people were the bricks beneath the nation's grand facade. Their labour was not invisible, only unrecognised. Rest now, cradled by this truth. The country's foundations are entwined with lives denied freedom, and in their struggle the seeds of justice and change were planted. In the next segment we will explore how history has been rewritten, how myths and memory have shaped collective understanding of the revolution. Let your breath soften, and your mind drift gently toward peaceful sleep. As you ease into a gentle calm, imagine a quiet library filled with aged books, delicate papers and fading ink, the keepers of history. The soft rustle of pages turning accompanies your thoughts. The story of the American Revolution, like all history, is shaped by those who tell it. Over time, the revolution has been romanticized, mythologized, and selectively remembered. Think of the grand portraits of George Washington, steadfast, dignified, commanding. The image of the Founding Fathers as flawless architects of liberty has become ingrained in national consciousness. But beneath this polished narrative lie complexities and silences. Enslaved people, Native Americans, women, and the rural poor often disappear from these stories. Imagine textbooks and monuments that focus on battles and declarations, while the voices of those who laboured, resisted, or suffered are muted or absent. This selective memory serves to comfort and unify, but it also obscures truth. In the 19th and 20th centuries, celebrations of the revolution emphasized ideals of freedom and democracy, yet often ignored the contradictions and exclusions woven into the nation's fabric. Civil rights movements and indigenous activism later challenged these omissions, bringing to light the experiences long ignored. Consider the stories passed down in families and communities, oral histories preserved by descendants of those left out of official accounts. These narratives offer different perspectives of courage, endurance, and resistance. As you breathe gently, imagine the mosaic of memories and myths that shape collective understanding. Each piece, bright or shadowed, adds depth and nuance. The process of rewriting history is ongoing. New scholarship uncovers forgotten stories. Museums and educators strive to include diverse voices. Communities reclaim their heritage. Rest now in this unfolding awareness. The past is not fixed. It is a living conversation between memory and truth. Let your breath slow, your mind soften, and your heart open to the fullness of history. In the final segment, we will reflect on the echoes of incomplete freedom that still resonate today. Let your thoughts drift peacefully as the night deepens. As you settle into the quiet embrace of night, imagine the present moment as a calm river flowing through the landscape of history. Its waters carry reflections of triumph and pain, of promise and broken vows. The American Revolution's legacy is not a finished tale, but a beginning. Freedom was declared, yet incomplete. For many, liberty was a distant hope, deferred or denied. Picture civil rights marches decades later. Men and women walking with determined steps under hot sun, their voices rising to demand the equality once promised. Hear the chants for voting rights, for fair treatment, for justice. Feel the quiet strength of native activists fighting for sovereignty and cultural survival. Imagine women standing firm, breaking barriers, claiming rights once withheld. Their struggles echo the battles fought centuries before. The fight for civil rights, tribal lands, gender equality, all are chapters in the ongoing quest to fulfill the revolution's true promise. Yet challenges remain. Systemic inequalities, racial injustices, and social divisions trace roots back to those early days. Understanding this history allows us to see how far we have come and how far we still must go. Breathe deeply now. Imagine the weight of generations. both the burdens carried and the hopes passed forward. The night is still, but the movement of progress continues, steady and persistent. You are part of this story, a witness and participant in the ongoing journey. Rest in this knowledge. The echoes of incomplete freedom remind us that liberty is a constant striving, not a gift freely given. Let your heart soften and your mind drift gently toward peaceful sleep, comforted by the thought that every step forward honors those who came before. Thank you for joining this quiet journey through the lesser-known paths of the American Revolution. Tonight, we explored the contradictions and complexities beneath the surface of freedom, whose voices were heard and whose were silenced. As you rest, may you carry with you a deeper understanding that history is woven from many threads, visible and hidden, and that true liberty requires remembering all stories, not just the celebrated ones. If this journey moved you, consider liking and subscribing gently, so that together we may uncover more truths that soothe and enlighten. Please share in the comments where and when you are watching, as your presence connects us across time and space. Now, breathe slowly, sink deeper into comfort, and let sleep carry you softly into dreams. Good night, good.